It was an unusually quiet summer noon in Forest Hill. Not a single car horn or a dog's bark behind those white picket fences. Only the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the faint sound of a few children pedaling their bikes along the path near the park. The houses looked as if they had been cut straight from the pages of an interior design magazine. Light-colored walls, lawns trimmed right to the edge, flowers planted in perfect lines. This was the kind of place people called an ideal neighborhood. Here everyone smiled when they saw each other. Everyone knew the names of the neighbors' pets, and every morning someone would step outside to water their plants or adjust the angle of their mailbox. But sometimes it's in the most perfect-looking places that the deepest cracks are hidden. Sergeant Mark Benson drove slowly through the neighborhood in his familiar patrol car. The window was slightly rolled down his left hand, resting casually on the wheel, and his eyes scanning each porch and parked vehicle. 22 years in the force had taught him to care little for reports or citations. What he trusted the most was his instinct. That vague, simmering feeling that came unexpectedly and one he had learned to follow with religious devotion. Then he saw her, Ava Thompson, 35 years old. Her deep-toned skin glistened under the sun, sweat running down her temples. Her breath heavy but not panicked. Wireless earbuds are in her ears, and her legs are moving in rhythm, steady and strong. She wore sleek workout clothes, not flashy, but sophisticated, worn by someone who knows exactly who they are. And something about her felt off to Mark Benson, not because she was doing anything wrong, just that she didn't look at him, didn't glance at the patrol car, didn't nod like the locals usually did when they saw a police officer. A small detail, but in his mind, it lit up like a warning light. Who is she? What's she doing here? Does she belong here? Nothing concrete. Just that feeling, that hazy instinct he had learned to trust like scripture. Mark lightly gripped the steering wheel, eyes trailing Ava as she jogged past a brand-new silver BMW parked at the entrance of house number 112. She didn't look back. Kept going her stride unbroken, and that was enough. He flicked the turn signal, tapped the brakes. The tires pressed gently against the hot asphalt. Everything remained quiet, but a storm had just begun to form in the calmest places. The patrol car rolled to a stop by the curb. The engine continued to hum softly, like it was holding its breath. Sergeant Mark Benson stepped out, tall, solidly, built, his dark uniform catching the light of the summer sun. His hand instinctively rested on his belt, not to draw a weapon, but just enough for his authority to be visible. Up ahead, Ava Thompson kept running, but after just a few more steps, she slowed, removed one earbud, and turned around with a calmness that seemed well practiced, as if she had faced this situation more than once. Her gaze swept over him, then settled. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked. Her chest rose and fell with the rhythm of her breath, but her voice was completely steady. Mark didn't respond right away. He scanned Ava from head to toe, premium running shoes, a fitted jacket, and a smartwatch on her wrist. She didn't look like someone hiding or doing anything wrong, and perhaps it was that very fact that unsettled him even more. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his voice dry, even and cold, the kind of tone sharpened over hundreds of traffic stops. Ava raised an eyebrow, slightly glanced down the street, and replied, "I live a few blocks up. Just started my morning run." Which house specifically? Ava's eyes lowered slowly, then returned to his face. A subtle shift, so slight in her expression. The ease from earlier pulled back, replaced with quiet alertness. "Number 134, she said. "I've lived there for almost 3 years. Mark gave a faint nod, but didn't let it go. "Do you have any identification on you?" The question dropped into the air, like a stone into a still lake. Ava gently tightened the strap, holding her phone on her arm, her eyes never leaving him. "No," she replied. "I'm out for a run." I didn't think carrying a wallet was necessary. Mark inhaled. Something inside him began to tighten, not fear, but the discomfort of being challenged. It's just procedure, he said. I need to verify. Ava placed her hands on her hips and tilted her head slightly. Her tone had changed, not soft anymore, but firm, calm and sharp, like silk turned into a blade. And where exactly does that procedure begin? With the fact that I didn't look at you as I ran by, or with the color of my skin? Mark pressed his lips together. It wasn't the first time he had heard that question, but never had it been said so precisely, so timely. A light breeze passed through. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of a lawnmower began. And in that moment, Forest Hill no longer felt peaceful. It felt hollow. You just passed a brand new BMW, Mark said, as though justifying himself. I have reason to investigate suspicious activity. Ava laughed, a short, dry sound without a hint of amusement. So now walking past a luxury car is considered suspicious. Mark didn't respond. He could feel control slipping, threading through his veins, but he stayed where he was, a shadow of unchecked authority. And Ava stood just as firmly in the midday sun, like a reflection of truth he desperately tried to ignore. Ava remained where she stood. Her posture was upright, her hands rested on her hips, and her face was neither hostile nor meek. Only her eyes had changed. They were no longer scanning or guarded. They were now filled with disappointment, a feeling deeper than anger. She looked at the man before her, not seeing a police officer anymore. Just a man straining to hold on to a sense of control, even when there was nothing left to control. "What do you want from me now?" Ava asked. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut straight like a blade. Mark took a step toward her. Not rushed, not aggressive, but with clear intent. The space between them was now less than a meter. His hand stayed on his belt, whether out of habit or as a subtle reminder, I have authority. Don't make this more difficult, he said. Just cooperate. Ava drew in a slow breath. In that moment, her mind played back every news segment, every story about people who looked like her, being detained for being in the wrong place, wrong way, with the wrong attitude, reel after reel, like an old documentary. You're trying to drag me into a script I didn't write, she said. And I'm not playing by the rules you made. The silence between them thickened so dense it could be felt by anyone watching. Mark gripped his belt strap tighter. Ava raised her phone. I'm calling someone, she said firmly. Someone who knows how to apply the law without using it to impose on civilians. In that moment, Mark saw something he couldn't bear. She wasn't afraid. She didn't plead. She didn't apologize. And to someone like Mark, that composure was nothing short of defiance. He didn't think. He reacted. His hand lunged forward, grabbing Ava's wrist and twisting it behind her back, with enough force to throw anyone off balance. The metal snap echoed sharply in the air, like a cut through silence. Ava struggled. What the hell? Obstruction of investigation, Mark stated flatly, as if pressing play on a line he'd used dozens of times. In broad daylight, the gleaming steel cuffs locked into place in the middle of the street, under the silent gazes beginning to gather from porches, balconies, and quietly raised phones. An older man pulled a phone from his robe pocket. A young woman stood frozen next to a baby stroller, and Ava stood there, not free, but never more powerful. You just made a big mistake, she hissed through gritted teeth. Mark didn't hear or didn't want to. In his mind, everything was simple, a non-compliant subject, a command ignored, a by-the-book arrest. He had no idea that at that moment he hadn't just arrested the wrong person, he had personally unraveled the final knot holding together the illusion of justice he had believed in all these years. The cuffs were locked. Ava stood tall, her hands clenched tightly behind her back, and her breathing tight but unbroken. Her eyes bore into Mark Benson's, not with pleading, not with protest, but as if recording every detail of this moment, ready to return it at the right time. Around them, the neighborhood began to stir. A middle-aged man stood on his porch phone, held level recording every silent second. A young woman pushing a stroller slowed on the opposite sidewalk, her eyes wide. Two children stopped pedaling their bikes, staring through a freshly painted white fence. No one said a word, but their witnessing spoke volumes. Mark called into the station, his voice flat, as if reading from a form Sergeant Benson. I have a 10 to 15 female subject, non-compliant. Requesting backup for transport to the station. Ava heard every word. She laughed a short, cold, dry sound. 10 to 15, she repeated almost mockingly. You think this is going to help you? Mark turned away. He still thought he was in control. He still believed in the system that had protected him for over 2 decades. A system he was part of, an old familiar cog. But Mark didn't feel familiar with this crowd. No one stopped him, but no one looked away either. Their silence wasn't submission, it was anticipation. A woman's voice rang out, clear, agitated, from the post office, a few houses down. She's just out for a jog. What exactly do you think she could be doing wrong in broad daylight? Mark looked up. His eyes passed over the woman and then over 3 more raised phones pointed at him. The air was no longer still. It vibrated every glance, step and finger tapping on a touchscreen. Ava exhaled. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Everything she needed, the light, the truth, and the public, had begun to arrive. And Mark, for the first time, felt unsure of the role he thought he'd been playing. Mark Benson stood motionless on the side of the road, one hand still gripping Ava Thompson's cuffed wrist, as if he had just apprehended a dangerous criminal. But there was no glory in his hands, only eyes watching, questioning, silently recording. He didn't know that at least 4 cameras were rolling, didn't know that the footage would be online within minutes. And he certainly didn't know that at that very moment someone else was approaching. Not quickly, not loudly, but with undeniable presence. A man's voice rose deep and clear. "Excuse me, officer. What exactly is going on here?" Mark turned. A man in a white shirt, grey tie vest, folded neatly over one arm. His posture relaxed, but his gaze was sharp as steel. There was something different about him. He didn't look like an ordinary civilian. He was calmly observant, not panicked or avoiding, like someone well-versed in making decisions. Mark's voice tightened, still trying to hold the upper hand. "Sir, please step back. This is an active investigation." The man didn't budge. He looked at Ava, still in cuffs, standing firm like an oak tree. Then back at Mark, with a gaze that seemed to peel away every layer of armor Mark had put on. "I'll ask again," he said slowly. "Why are you arresting her?" Mark took a breath and answered like reciting a line he'd memorized. She refused to provide identification when asked and exhibited non-compliant behavior during an investigation into suspicious activity. Ava let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I jogged past a luxury car, and he decided I looked suspicious." The man nodded slightly, then turned back to Mark, this time with a tone that carried the weight of command. "And do you have any evidence that she was doing anything wrong, or is it simply because you felt she was?" Mark opened his mouth, but his throat tightened. The words he usually used to assert dominance to cover up no longer worked on this man. A different sound cut through the thickening tension, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up beside them. No sirens, no special plates, but Mark recognized the type of vehicle. And when the door opened, his heart dropped to his stomach. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Harris, the highest-ranking officer in the district, stepped out. His face was as cold as winter water, and his steps were deliberate and heavy, like stone pressing into pavement. "Benson," he said, "no need to raise your voice. Uncuff her. Now." Mark froze. His heart pounded. The familiar sensations of power, certainty, and righteousness vanished instantly. "Colonel, sir," he stammered. She refused to show ID. Victor cut him off. His voice was low and decisive. "She is not required to carry ID, and you have just made a serious mistake." Ava said nothing. She turned her head to look at Mark, her expression not angry, not screaming, but something far heavier, absolute undeniable disappointment. She was about to say the words that would rip apart the last thread holding Mark's image of himself together. Mark Benson stood frozen, his hand resting lightly on the cold metal clasped around Ava Thompson's wrist. The air around him wasn't air anymore, it was pressure bearing down on every heartbeat. Colonel Victor Harris stepped closer, his eyes leaving no room for excuses. "I'll repeat it, Benson. Remove the cuffs." Mark hesitated. All buzzed in his head were the echoes of authority, of a long-held belief in his righteousness, his instincts. But the voice of his superior and the eyes of everyone around him left him no more room to stall. His fingers trembled as he inserted the key into the lock. The soft click echoed like the snapping of his spine. Ava pulled her hands back, rubbing the red marks on her wrists, but she didn't retreat. She didn't walk away. She stayed, and then she spoke. "I suppose you still don't know who I am." Her voice was quiet, but it traveled far through the thickened air. Mark said nothing. The vein on his temple throbbed. Ava stepped forward, her gaze fixed on him, stripping him bare, and she spoke each word as sharp as glass. "I am Ava Thompson, Chief of Police, Fulton County." Not a sound. No one breathed. Time froze, caught in one endless heartbeat. Mark didn't blink. The word chief rang out like a sentence. His throat went dry. The crowd began to murmur. A few phones buzzed, spreading the news like fire. Ava let the silence linger long enough for her words to sink into his skin, like fire soaking through fabric. Then she continued, this time, every word like a needle driven straight into his awareness. "And you just arrested, humiliated, and handcuffed your highest-ranking superior in broad daylight with no justification solely because of the color of her skin and your prejudice." Mark had nothing left to say, nothing left to hold on to. His face burned, but his hands were cold as ice. "She's the chief," someone in the crowd whispered. "Oh my God." Victor Harris crossed his arms, turned to Mark and said in a low and final voice, "Sergeant Benson, as of this moment you are suspended from duty. Turn in your badge and your weapon, right now." Mark's hand trembled as he removed his badge, the symbol he once thought represented justice. He placed it in Victor's palm as if it weighed twice as much. Ava looked at him, not with hatred, but with the cold disappointment of someone who once believed the system could be reformed from within. She stepped forward and bowed her head slightly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut like a razor. "You thought I didn't belong here just because I didn't fit what you were used to. And that very thought is why you no longer belong here." Mark Benson stood there, a man who once believed he held power and reason, now reduced to the shadow of who he thought he was. Sergeant Mark Benson stood in the middle of the street, which he once believed belonged to him. There were no sirens, no shouting, only the wind brushing over rooftops, and the eyes of the people around him were no longer filled with fear, but with disdain and disbelief. His hands trembled as he unholstered his weapon and placed it in Lieutenant Colonel Victor Harris's hand. The faint sound of metal landing in a palm was barely audible, but in Mark's mind it rang like the slam of a door sealing the end of his career. Victor said nothing more. He turned away, not glancing back, no moral lesson or scolding, because Ava Thompson's final look had already said it all. Ava stepped forward, the red mark still fresh on her wrists, but her posture as straight and steady as ever. "You thought the badge gave you the right to point fingers at anyone, issue commands, belittle and humiliate just because they weren't like you." She paused, her voice lowering just enough that only he could hear it, but heavy enough that he would never forget. "You thought I was someone insignificant, someone not worth listening to, a shadow passing by. And just because I didn't bow my head, you decided I was a threat." Mark didn't reply. He couldn't because he had played the role of the villain entirely too well, in front of far too many witnesses. Ava took another step forward, her eyes locking onto his, not to destroy him, but to hand back the weight. "If I hadn't been the chief today, if I were just an ordinary woman, would I have walked away from this on my own 2 feet?" Mark swallowed hard. His throat tightened. His eyes wavered for the first time in many years. He wasn't sure he was a good man. Ava leaned in slightly and whispered, "You're not just wrong. You're dangerous. And the worst part is, you don't even know it." Mark closed his eyes for a moment, a short moment but heavier than any interrogation he had ever led. She turned and walked away. No glare, no insult. Her silence after everything was the deepest punishment of all. As Ava walked toward the black SUV, the surrounding eyes followed her, not with suspicion, but with the reverence reserved for a true leader. And Mark, all he had left was the faded echo of the handcuffs just removed and the sharp ache of realizing he was no longer Sergeant Benson. He was simply a man who had let fear and prejudice destroy himself. The black SUV rolled out of Forest Hill, leaving behind the quiet street, the silent eyes of neighbors, and a lone man standing in the midday sun, no badge, no weapon, no reason left to be proud. Mark Benson sat in the patrol car, engine off. His hands rested on his thighs, slightly curled, as if still remembering what it felt like to grip the wrist of an innocent person. He looked out at the familiar neighborhood through the windshield, still the same pristine homes and perfectly trimmed lawns. But something had changed. It wasn't the neighborhood, it was him. Mark had always believed he was a fair cop. He didn't discriminate, and he followed procedure. That he only acted when his instinct told him to. But today, everything fell apart. Today, he didn't protect anyone. He only safeguarded his prejudice. And in his mind, Ava's final question echoed, "If I weren't the chief, would I have walked away on my own 2 feet?" And Mark couldn't answer, because he knew that if it hadn't been Ava Thompson, but another black woman with no title or authority, the story might not have ended with just a pair of handcuffs. It might have ended with sirens, with blood, with another name turned into a hashtag. He looked into the rearview mirror. His face stared back, not the face of someone delivering justice, but the face of someone who had just made justice lose a little more of its trust. Mark exhaled, heavy, exhausted. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from, for the first time, looking directly at himself, without flinching. I didn't see her, not because she was invisible, but because he had never tried to see. Ava Thompson had left, taking with her a dignity and strength he could never break. But what she left behind, heavier than any arrest warrant, deeper than any insult, was a truth he could never shake. Justice doesn't live in a badge. It doesn't live in a gun. And it certainly doesn't live in a feeling called instinct. Justice lives in how we use power when we think no one is watching. And today the whole world was watching. This is not just a story about an officer arresting the wrong person. It's about a system built far too long on fear, bias, and mistaken instincts that no one dared to question. The question isn't, why did this happen? It's how many more times will we let it happen before we change?